The Gemara in the 19th parak in Shabbos goes through the laws of Mila. And the Gemara in Kuf Lamed Hey, Kuf Lamed Daled discusses the issue of Mila on Shabbos. Can we do a Bris Mila, since by doing a Bris Mila drawing blood, which could involve the biblical prohibition, so is one permitted to do Bris Mila on Shabbos? So the Gemara learns out from a pasuk in Parashat Tazria, Ubayom Hashmini Yimo Bisar Olaso. On the 8th day, one has to circumcise their baby male child. And the Gemara makes a drasha Ubayom Afilu B'Shabbos. So that's the standard psak of halacha, 354 days a year, 365 days, 383, whichever year we're talking about, a leap year. There's not a day that a Bris Mila cannot be done. That is, of course, a Bris Mila Bizmana. That is a Bris Mila done on the 8th day. A Mila Shelo Bizmana, that already cannot be done on Shabbos, and other days as well. So the Gemara tells us halacha from the juxtaposition of the psukim, because the pasuk in Parashat Tazria says Isha ki Tazria v'yalda zacha. There's a juxtaposition between a woman giving birth and becoming Tamei Leda and the baby being circumcised on day 8. So the Gemara has a drasha. A woman only becomes Tamei through a normal type of, or natural type of childbirth. That's why the Gemara talks about in Shabbos whether a C-section baby, whether a C-section baby, should the bris be on day 1 or day 8? Why day 1? Because since a woman doesn't become biblically impure because she doesn't see from the dam from the makor because she's having a C-section, so therefore the Gemara has a discussion there whether you should be day 1 or day 8. So halach l'maisa sveika dedina, we do it day 8, unless of course day 8 Shabbos. We don't do it because all week long if it's day 1, day 8 works, but if it's day 8, day 1 doesn't work. But on Shabbos you can't do it day 8 because maybe it's day 1. It's only a suffix Mila Bizmana, and therefore we don't do a C-section baby on Shabbos. So comes along the Gemara in Chagiga, Daf Tes Zayin Amid Aleph. It talks about the famous case of bathhouse insemination. Whether science says it's possible, whether it was possible or not. The Gemara talks about that someone, a male went in and let's say they had zera, and then the woman came after and she became pregnant. So that's bathhouse insemination. So Rabbeinu Chananel on that Gemara, that's the Gemara is talking about a Kohen Gadol marrying a Basula. So that's a discussion, could you be a pregnant Basula or not, if the woman became pregnant through bathhouse insemination. So Rav Chananel writes on this Gemara, this is a Maisa Nisim, this is a miraculous act, and therefore it does not meet the criteria of Isha ki Tazria v'yalda zacha v'tama sheba jamim, and therefore Rabbeinu Chananel says there is one cannot circumcise the child. When do we say Yom Shemini B'Shabbos? That's on a normal childbirth because it's too much Shiva Shamim. But in a case where it's a miraculous birth, so therefore we can't do the Mila on Shabbos from bathhouse insemination. That's Rabbeinu Chananel. Comes along, that's a big chiddush, because the Gemara talks about a C-section where the birth was actually different. Here we're talking about the birth is the same, but the conception perhaps was miraculous. So it comes along with Shlomo Zalman in the Mincha Shlomo, And he says, what's pshat in Rabbeinu Chanano? He gives two possibilities. And what does Rabbi Chanano mean? That one is that since the conception happened miraculously, therefore women do not become tamei at birth, and therefore there's no din of Mila on the 8th day. Since it occurred, and the other explanation, not that necessarily it was miraculous, but it happened in an unconventional manner, not the normal way, and therefore, and also you can't do a Mila on Shabbos. Rav Shlomo Zalman is noted during the second side. He thinks that as long as it's unconventional, you also can't do a Mila on Shabbos. So based on his explanation, his second interpretation of Rabbeinu Chananel, Rav Shlomo Zalman says, therefore it's best that someone who is artificially inseminated, so that means it's unconventional, so you don't become tamei. Hence, there's no halacha of Shemini b'Shabbos, and therefore Rav Shlomo Zalman paskins, someone born through artificial insemination should not have the bris done on Shabbos. And in fact, Rav Shachter also says similar to Rav Shlomo Zalman, and says also one should not have a bris on Shabbos. Rav J. David Bleich in his, he's the one who writes the contemporary halachas for him, and he writes in the tradition. He says that he agrees it applies to artificial insemination. He says as well it would apply to in vitro fertilization, since it's not considered the normal way of becoming pregnant, even though it's becoming more popular, but still not the normal way. And therefore, he says as well, you can't do a bris on the 8th day. He points out, of course, that it's no one's business whether you use in vitro artificial insemination, how the child came about. So you have no obligation to tell them. You could just tell them a white lie, so to speak. The child is jaundice or whatever, and therefore we can't do the bris on Shabbos. So on the other side, in the Sephardi range, I know a Chacham Avadja. It's quoted in the Yalkut Yosef that one can perform a Bris Mila on Shabbos that was conceived through artificial insemination or in vitro fertilization, because Pashtus, it seems to me the Pashtus, because the Gemara over there is talking about a C-section, and therefore, remember when Rabbi Chananel is usually not, he's not generally brought down as a posting, even though, he's one of the Rishonim. And also it's two pshatim in what Rav Shlomo Zalman is saying. So Rabbi Yosef says that a baby conceived by in vitro or artificial insemination, the Mila can be done on Shabbos. And perhaps maybe if one can do it, then you should do it, because we want a Mila Bismana. Of course, even if the bris was done, maybe, and it shouldn't have, but the bris is still good. It's just it's a machlokas among the poskim in terms of whether one should, since it's a shaila anyway, in terms of whether we go with the Rabbeinu Chananel. So, to summarize, we pointed out the halacha of Bris Mila b'Shmona is connected to Tumas Leida. It's only when a woman has a child through a normal pregnancy, so we know Bris Mila on day 8. The Gemara is a shaila of a C-section because of that. Is an isha Tmei Leida or not? She's not, therefore do you go by day 1 and day 8? That's the Gemara. Rabbi Chanano had a big chiddush based on the Gemara in Chagiga on bathhouse insemination, but since it's a miraculous occurrence, so therefore there is no bris on Shabbos. That leads Rav Shlomo Zalman give two interpretations of Rabbeinu Chananel. Either it's miraculous, so therefore artificial insemination isn't miraculous, or in vitro, so then it wouldn't apply to that. But according to the second explanation, in the non-conventional, it would apply. So Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rav Hershel Shafta go l'chumra, and Rav J. David Bleich, whether it's artificial insemination in vitro, they're not considered non-conventional, and therefore they wouldn't have a bris. On a regular week, you'll have a day 8, but since on Shabbos, you only could do a Mila Bizmana, so he'd say no bris on Shabbos. Ravaji Yosef goes against that. He says no, whether it's in vitro or artificial insemination. He apparently is working with the first explanation of Rabbi Hanano, just going with the Pshuto, that since it's a conventional birth, therefore the conception isn't relevant, and therefore one would have the bris on day 8 afilu b'Shabbos. Ubayom hashmini yimo b'sar Allah. So the Torah gives us a mitzvah of Bris Mila, and as we all know, a Bris Mila involves chabura, involves usually drawing blood. It's part of the mitzvah, drawing blood from the child or from the adult. And part of the mitzvah, or whether it's part of the mitzvah, we'll discuss, but an aspect of a Bris Mila, as we know, it could be painful. Certainly if for an adult convert or an adult Jew, for a baby, is a discussion whether the baby actually feels or why the baby's crying. So there's a discussion in the poskim. It usually comes up in cases of an adult convert or adult Jew. What about doing anesthesia? What about either putting local or taking a general in order to minimize the pain? Is it permitted to use any anesthesia? So the different schools of thought. On one hand, you have from the Imre Yosher of Meir Arek. He says you certainly can't take a general, but even a local anesthetic is a problem. He says because a key component of the mitzvah Mila is the pain one feels. It's part of the mitzvah. And because if not, why didn't Chazal give us different medications to take? Because we know that anesthetics were around, or like the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, when the person was Nigmar Adin and heading to the Gemar Din, heading to be put to death, they gave him a little couple of spices, this and that drinks, in order that he knows his mind. So the fact that Chazal did not do things to try to prevent the pain of Bris Mila, he wants to point out that it's usher to do. He wants to bring a raya from a medrash by Avram Avinu that he suffered pain, so Hashem will give him more reward, but that doesn't show anywhere that Avram was commanded to. Maybe he just chose to. And that's what Rav Bleich explains, and others point pshat in the Imre Yosher, is by other mitzvahs, pain might be incidental. You're not getting reward for putting on tefillin because it's painful. From Sarag, you always have that, but there's no special inyan. However, Masha Ein Kain, Imre Yosher is saying that experiencing pain is part of the aspect of Bris Mila, and therefore one should not take even a local anesthetic. So that's the shita of the Imre Yosher. On the other hand, we have the Tshuvas Maharsham and Chacham Avaja and Avaja Yosef, who go to the other extreme. They permit full anesthesia even for an adult. The Imre Yosher says you can't even use a local on a. You can't even use a local. You can't even use a local on an adult. While Avaja Yosef permits full anesthesia even for an adult. And he quotes from the famous tshuva of the Marach Arzarua. He has a whole discussion on what mitzvahs require shlichus or exempt from shlichus. So part of the yisod is the mitzvahs. The mitzvah Mila is not the Maisa Mila, it's the fact that you're being gemalt. Hence he says that it's irrelevant, so therefore, even though in general we say mitzvah shlichus kavana, however, the kavana is only on if you have a Maisa mitzvah. But if it's result oriented, you don't need kavana. And therefore, the Marsham writes that in the Avaja Yosef, he permits full anesthesia even on an adult. On the other hand, you have the 3 Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who takes a middle approach. He says, he doesn't like the Imre Yosher that pain is inherent, integral to the mitzvah. And he also points out that we know in general we have a klal mitzvah strichas kavana, and according to the Maggid HaRambam, especially on a mitzvah min haTorah, it's likuva, and therefore, especially by an adult convert, so therefore, a person's entering Kedushas Yisrael, now they should be sleeping during the Mila. So therefore, he was much more reluctant to do a general by an adult. You know, you can permit a local one because you don't have to have the pain. So there seems to be a fundamental machlokes, the Maharsham and the Sri Eish, in terms of how do we look at someone who's under the general anesthesia. So the Maharsham says we look at someone who's sleeping, and therefore you could still apply, you know, the shlichus doesn't end. Well, according to the Sri Eish, you're a lot less, you know, you're like a rock, it's like you're nothing. And therefore they point out, it's the whole thing of Shlomo Zalman as a tshuva, about perhaps when someone's sleeping, could you take him out of the sukkah or not? So those are the three schools of thought in terms of using the different types of anesthesia. And the bottom line is that for adults, it seems to be that local anesthesia is okay, and perhaps there's a distinction. An adult-born Jew, you could use a general also if you need it. However, all poskim say for an adult convert, you can't use it. So it's best not to use it at all, but for an adult, for a Jew, it could be more lenient. But over here, by the conversion, you have to be more strict. And in terms of the local anesthesia, taking away the pain, so people seem to administer local when the time calls for it.